If you were free on a Saturday night and wanted a guaranteed place to chill, Habits Cafe in Oakley was the place to do it. With a massive beer list and a curated jukebox, Habits was a great place to meet new and old neighbors alike. But some special patrons may meet some permanent paranormal residents who never quite left the building. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful episode of the Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities presents the Hometown Haunts podcast. I am your host, Cat Loco, and along with me in the shadows are Jen Kohler and Christina Wald, and we'll hear more from them in just a minute. I'm just going to sound a little bit hoarse again. I am so sorry. All of your eardrums may hate me after the end of this episode. I don't know. Anyway, let's see. So, to stay up to date with our show, you can follow us at Sin Cabinet Curio on Twitter and at Cincy Cabinet of Curiosities on Instagram. You can join our Facebook group, Hometown Haunts, also to share all of your spooky stories. Of course, we're dying to hear about your personal paranormal encounters with the paranormal and fringe history from your neck of the woods. Please send it to hometownhauntedmail@gmail.com or join and share it on our Facebook group, Hometown Haunts. You can find our podcast where you listen and watch our show, and you can watch our show feed on YouTube. Just find us by searching Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities. Please take a moment to rate and review us on those platforms so other spooky story lovers like yourself can find the show. Of course, the link is in the show notes. Also, we have a few different show news pieces. We will be at the inaugural Frogman Fest this March 4th at the Great Wolf Lodge Conference Center in Mason, Ohio. We will have copies of both issues of the Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities Comics Anthology, cryptid posters, and stickers. Find a friend of the show and author extraordinaire, James Willis, is a featured speaker, along with other folklorists, cryptozoologists, and artists from really all over. I know we have a lot of West Virginia artists that have started popping up saying they're going to be going. So it should be fun. We can talk about cryptids from West Virginia and all those hollers like we did a few episodes ago. You can find more information at frogmanfestival.com. This same month, on March 18th, 2023, we will be at the Highland Heights Comic Con at Northern Kentucky University Student Union. And I don't think there are any more artists or vendor tables left, but you can buy tickets to go. And that will be at a link we'll have in our show notes because that link keeps changing and not being consistent. But it should be a fun new event for everyone. So, sources for tonight's show is the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Cincinnati Post, the Cincinnati City Beat, Cincinnati Haunted Handbook by Jeff and Michael Morris. I finally found my copy, and the Cincinnati Ghosts by Karen Lavin. Also, the Oakley Neighborhood Council and WCPO News. Oakley was originally a village known as 4 Mile on the old Madison Turnpike in the mid 19th century, so aptly named because it was about 4 miles away from Cincinnati proper. 4 Mile became a popular stagecoach stop on the turnpike, and in 1869 officially registered their new village name, Oakley, named for the many oak trees that grew in the village. We were certainly creative people, weren't we? Oakley was once the residence of Phoebe Ann Moss, known as Annie to her friends and family, when she married her husband Frank E. Butler. Annie was a local sharpshooter who grew up outside Cincinnati and had impressed her future husband at a shooting challenge when his Bonin and Butler Shooting Act was performing in the city. His stage name was Buffalo Bill. Hers became Annie Oakley. Together they would perform for decades in the world-famous Buffalo Bill Wild West show. There is a mural dedicated to Annie Oakley titled Little Sure Shot, painted on Voltage Furniture's high-rise tower in the center of Oakley. The mural was designed by Nicole Trimble and sponsored by Artwork Cincinnati. I mention this because it's an awesome mural that you see whenever you're driving in from the west side of town, from the east to the west. You get to see it right on Madison Road. The village of Oakley grew to being a stop on the Baltimore and Ohio Southwest Railroad, but what really put it on the map was the Oakley Race Course, which was constructed in 1890 between Minot and Robertson Avenue. During the few years that the track was open, it became a famous thoroughbred racing area. However, the tract was short-lived, and Ohio outlawed betting in 1905. Parts of the former clubhouse are now part of a private residence in Oakley. Just a note, if you live along Minot Avenue from Edwards Road to Inyard Avenue, and on the following streets, the 28th Street, Millsbury, Eileen Drive, 31st, 32nd, 33rd, 34th, Fern Avenue, Brownway Avenue, and Appleston Street, your home now stands on the old racetrack. So that includes some listeners of our show. Also, this is where the old Kenner factory was, as well as a few plastics factories, which have now all been sold off and are being turned into one gigantic development, which also would have stood on the old racetrack. So that entire part of Oakley was an old racetrack. That same year, in 1905, the racetrack land and the property surrounding it was purchased by the Cincinnati Milling Machine Plant. The mill, as it is called, is largely responsible for the growth of Oakley into the 20th century. So a part of the growth of Oakley was the Lenox Building, built in 1900 as a mixed-use office and retail building on Oakley Square. It sits at an awkward intersection at Madison Road, Alston Avenue, and Marquette Street on the eastern edge of Oakley Square. Edward A. Reef was the builder and was responsible for many of the buildings in Oakley and Hyde Park, such as the School for St. Mary's, the actual school building in Hyde Park, the Mission on Edwards Road, the Virginia and Monteith buildings in Hyde Park Square, as well as the former Hyde Park Theater. The Lenox houses a variety of retail and restaurant fronts on the ground floor, while the upper floors are apartments and office spaces for rent. So I found some interesting tidbits about the Lenox through the past few hundred years it's been open, basically. Over 100 years, 123 now. So we have a lot of interesting organizations and people that have lived there. In 1918, it was home to W.J. Bates, who stabbed his brother-in-law, Ralph Trotter, to death on a train bound for Cincinnati. And at one point, in 1926, you could rent an apartment in the building for $126 a month. That sounds lovely. The Eastern Hills Softball League also called the Lenox Building home in 1938, and that Hyde Park, Oakley, Madisonville, Norwood, and Walnut Hills all had teams in the league. I do not know what their scores were, though. So go Oakley and go Walnut Hills. In the 1960s and 70s, Oakley was in decline, however. But in 1980, a new tenant of the Lenox Building opened, Habits Cafe. Its opening was a little rough. In its first year, some local juveniles managed to steal the darts out of Habits Cafe and proceeded to puncture holes in the tires of 30 cars along an 8-block area of Alston, Minot, 33rd, and 34th Streets. The police did find the darts in the cars and on the roadways. It was just chalked up to being juveniles and pranking everybody by blowing out their tires. It was the 80s, everyone. Different times. Besides that incident, though, Habits Cafe was a bar and restaurant that was enjoyed by the new local residents of Oakley, young couples and first-time homebuyers in the city. Described as a jukebox bar in the 1982 Cincinnati Enquirer article, the co-owners of Habits strove to create a welcoming environment with the music that they loved. Ed Hall, one of the 4 original co-owners, curated the music selections from his over 700 record collection. That's a lot of records. Mark Rogers, a longtime owner of Habits and one of the most often interviewed co-owners, tirelessly worked on building a welcoming atmosphere for patrons. He says, "We didn't want to be a cliquey spot where you have to be part of the in crowd to come in," as he said for the same Inquirer article. Habits Cafe was also known for its burgers. And I think as soon as I mentioned that this was going to be the topic of tonight's show, Christina said, "Are we going to talk about the strange burgers?" Because, man, for at least 20 years, the strange burgers just dominate every news article that has anything to do with Habits Cafe. That's what they wanted to talk about. Their jazz, their blues, and their funky burgers, especially their ostrich burger. They were very proud of this ostrich burger. So, yeah. It was fun just going through all the articles, and they're just like, try our ostrich burger. Also, the great thing was the large amount of beers that they had on tap. And a lot of the photos of the bar would just be their gigantic bar top and then just easily 20, 30 different beers on tap. So made it a really fun neighborhood place to eat. I know I have eaten there. I believe Jen has eaten there. She's nodding. And Christina, who is off screen, is probably nodding. I know, yes, she's giving me a nod, everyone. It's like a Ouija board session. Just, yeah. Uh, we got all nods. So we've all eaten there. We'll talk about it a little bit after I'm done with this. So, however, there is one thing that Habits had that no other establishment except for the 20th Century Theater had on Oakley Square, and that is a true crime ghost story. So here are the legends. The history of the Lenox Building is a vague puzzle of bars, businesses, and rumored illegal dealings that were kept off the books. However, out of that mysterious puzzle grew a ghost story that has been retold between locals, newspapers, and now has made it into haunted history books and podcasts. Rumor has it that in the 1940s, the bar that occupied the area that was Habit's Cafe was called Luke's Lounge, and that owners were involved with a number of illegal fencing operations with the mob, often happening at the bar. The owner paid off a crooked cop to ensure that his illegal operations would remain quiet, and they did so until the cop was found shot to death in the basement of the Lenox building. The owner of the lounge was immediately suspected because of previous burglary convictions and his connections with the mob. There are claims that the Lenox building was owned by the Irish Mafia in the 1940s, and another story states that illegal gambling was occurring in the basement. In this story, not only does the crooked cop get gunned down in the basement, but the former lounge owner also is shot dead in the back street of the building 2 weeks later. Another version of the policeman's story tells the tale of a severely intoxicated patron who became belligerent when the bartender stopped serving them. When the police were called, the patron was in the basement and grabbed a shotgun and shot a police officer entering the basement in the head when they entered the basement. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Yeah, all these stories, somehow a policeman ends up dead in the basement. What is known is that the basement of the Lenox building is haunted by a man described to be wearing an all-white zoot suit and fedora, white shoes, and had a very pale face. His apparition has been witnessed. I'll start again. His apparition has been witnessed by not only bar staff, but also the co owner's young sons when they were around 7 years old and playing in the basement. According to the story, they reported back to their dads that this man who was floating a few feet off the ground and was talking to them. The boys described the apparition as running up a second set of stairs in the basement away from the boys when they all noticed each other in the basement. When the boys reached Mark Rogers, they told him what he saw, and he immediately went to the basement to investigate, thinking that there was an intruder on the premises. He found no one, and all the doors were locked. Phantom footsteps have often been heard while Phantom footsteps have also been heard while staff work in the basement, as well as cold spots and the feeling of being watched the entire time you were there. A line cook for the bar was apparently followed by the entity in the basement. When she went down to the cooler in the basement to fetch some supplies, she noticed a bright red light emanating from one of the other rooms in the basement. When she called out if anyone was down there with her, the light faded into a ball and chased her from the basement and back up the stairs. This same line cook had kitchen appliances flung at her, such as a waffle iron and the kitchen clock, which fell to her feet. She also found herself locked inside the basement a number of times while working there. Other employees have had rolls of toilet paper thrown at them in the basement while fetching supplies from there, or food, or whatnot. Patrons have found their phones and camera batteries drain quickly. Similar to the kitchen, objects on the bar move around or are tossed off the bar top completely. Lights also turn on and off on their own. Another ghost who has been witnessed around the bar room is much more modest in appearance. He is said to wear a baseball cap when he walks into the bar, usually seen out of the corner of staff's eyes. Just a short glimpse or a shadow of the fellow. No one knows who this spirit could be. However, with all these ghost stories, there is a little myth busting, which came very surprising to me. So, a former police officer for the Cincinnati Police Department and crime historian Patrick Overly has documentation that there was a crooked police officer in the Oakley district who had a special liquor premise permit relationship with one of the bars, and the owner of the bar did have previous burglary charges. However, this case happened in the 1970s, not the 1940s. Also, in the 1940s, the Lenox building was owned by a woman named Mary A. Dyer and Mary A. Fegley. Fegley. Okay, I'm going to re-say that given how we were just talking about things earlier. So, also in the 1940s, the Lenox building was owned by Mary A. Dyer and Mary L. Fegley, and with Mary Fegley owning the property until 1965. Now, Dyer can be an Irish last name, but it also can be English. The Irish Mafia is a real thing, but in Ohio it is located in Cleveland, and the most notorious is an Italian American Cleveland the Italian American Cleveland Syndicate, who were quite active in Newport and were known to be quite ruthless. The syndicate also had crooked police officers in Newport working for them, so the story isn't easy to believe happening in Oakley during the 1940s through the 70s. Does this mean that the Cincinnati sect of the Irish Mafia couldn't exist? No. But does the link between Dyer and the Irish mob is pretty shaky? And as Patrick Overly put in his interview for the Cincinnati Enquirer back in 2006, this story is nothing more than an urban legend, and that it has existed for at least a quarter of a century, since 2006. So that would put it happening, the urban legend being created around the 1970s to early 80s. And he also said, pardon the pun, but it won't die out. So, Habits Cafe legacy. In 2019, the new owners of the Lenox building gave Habits Cafe only 30 days to vacate the space they had for nearly 40 years. Originally, there were plans to move to the former Oakley laundromat across the street from Habits Cafe, since Mike Rogers owned it and the 20th Century next door, which also is home to a ghost. The space that Habits once occupied is now home to Zypher Hair Salon and Rosewood Thai and Sushi as of recording. And so, if there are any ghosts still remaining and you've experienced them and you work at either of those two places or live in the apartment complex above them, please write to us and let us know what you've experienced. I have heard of ghost stories from those apartments that things move, doors shut on their own, and shadow people have been walking through the hallways. I've heard this from people who used to live there. So, which piqued my curiosity as to who could be haunting the Lenox building. In October of 2021, it was announced that Mark Rogers sold the 20th Century Theater to Bronson Tribby of Blue Ash. Tribby has since taken care in renovating the theater, and this year has painted murals of famous faces from Hollywood along the outside walls, giving Oakley Square a wonderful artsy atmosphere if you visit today. So, that is the story of Habits Cafe. I'm sorry if it was a little here and there, and my voice kind of gave out at one point. But thoughts, ladies, come back and
How
talk.
cool! I had no idea.
Yeah,
I had the ostrich burger. It was very dry.
all right.
Did anyone else try it?
No,
I did try it.
I am not a brave eater in that respect, but I have had their burgers and I have always enjoyed going there.
Yeah.
Oh, I
there.
enjoyed going there.
Yeah.
I just, I had to try. I'm
Yeah.
naturally curious.
I've had ostrich. I don't think it was from there, but their burgers were very good. They were very tall. They were always very big.
Yeah.
So, and juicy. That
Well,
was
I think it's hard when you're making a burger from leaner meat for it to be juicy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that ostrich or emu or whatever it was is a bit leaner. And so that's probably why it was dry.
Oh, yeah.
Is that the only thing you can remember about it? It was just dry. Did it taste like a cow or a
I mean,
chicken
most meats do not have, that distinctive a flavor. Most of what you taste is probably the herbs. I mean, obviously, probably one of the stronger flavored meats is mutton.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of people that eat say, like when you eat lamb, you taste a little bit of that gamey, sort of muttony flavor.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's supposed to be one of the stronger flavors. But when
Yeah.
I have had bear and venison, and I don't remember the flavor being that, I mean, slightly different, but not that different.
Yeah. Bear was really chewy. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
probably
it was
less tender.
gamey
What kind
tasting.
of bear did you know? Black,
It was a
grizzly,
black
brown?
bear. Um, and it was a delicacy, so it was something that didn't happen frequently.
Mhm.
And
My grandma used to make rabbit a lot, and rabbit tastes pretty good.
I will not eat thumper. Not ever.
mm-mm.
I love bunnies. No.
Yeah, it's being a
But
former
we
bunny owner.
digress.
No.
From culinary expertise to the ghost story was really interesting, and
Yeah.
I forgot about last time we sketched in Oakley, I sketched that building that has Annie
Mhm.
Oakley on it, and I was
Yeah.
actually in Annie Get Your Gun in high school. So
Fun. Yeah, it's always fun talking about Annie Oakley, and we should probably talk about her in a different episode
she
because
would
she's
probably be great to talk about in the episode because that whole time period was so weird.
it was so
Yeah.
weird, and she's from outside of Cincinnati and is only buried a few like an easy hour drive from here. So,
Mhm.
and also Buffalo Bill died only 17 days after she did of a broken heart.
Aw.
So he would not eat after she died.
Aw.
So they were a very loving couple. They were married for a really long time. And also Annie was a huge suffragette, and she was very, very pro women should get guns and know how to defend themselves, and um big suffragette basically back before,
Mhm.
just at the very beginning of that movement was taking off. And she kept doing, like, when they died, they gave all their money to charity, all of it.
Oh,
Wow.
nice.
And as they never had children of their own, so they just gave it as to orphanages and as many charities as possible.
Oh, wow.
So
So
they
interesting.
were a nice couple. And I know the idea of guns now will make people recoil, which I totally get, but what they did back then was very different. And she also made a lot of enemies for her activism.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
but
they didn't
so
have AR-15s then either.
that
Thank
is
God.
very true. They
Exactly. I
did
was
not.
thinking the exact same thing, Jen. I was like,
Yeah.
well,
They
a
did not have
musket
that.
is
Mm-mm.
something that kind of took a long time to load and shoot.
Yeah,
Well,
it did.
as
and
opposed
the amount
to
of skill
an
involved
AR-14.
in that
Oh, yes.
is amazing.
Yeah, she was ambidextrous, so she could shoot her pistol or her shotgun from either hand, from either side, and also backwards. So she was just extremely good, which means her hand-eye coordination was just astronomical.
Mhm.
But
And I trip over a flat floor. So
yeah, the rugs get me.
But the whole mafia story was interesting.
Yeah,
mean-
that was an interesting thing where the Irish mafia was thrown in out of nowhere. And what I also find interesting is that so many of the ghost stories say top up and down that it was a police officer shot and killed in the basement of the Lennox building. And I spent all day yesterday going through archives, police archives, the newspaper archives, local history archives, could not find any police officer shot and killed in a basement. And the other thing that's fascinating is the fact that the apparition that's described is wearing a white zoot suit. So
a man in white.
It's a man in white instead of a lady in white, which kudos to Habits Cafe in the Lennox building for upending that trope. But it's fascinating that if it could be the police officer and he just wanted to wear a zoot suit into the afterlife, he can do that. That's his call to do. But zoot suit was a particular fashion from the 40s, late 30s, maybe. It has, I believe, its history in Black culture first before being appropriated into white culture at the time. Somebody may be screaming at me for that one. Write in if I'm wrong, but I thought that's what happened. And yeah, it's interesting how that particular apparition is constantly seen. It's only been really seen by two kids who were 7 back in the 80s, 90s. I don't actually know how old the boys were because I know they were 7, but I don't know what date this happened at. I just know that these stories, all these ghost stories, started around 2006 being broadcast on local news into these books that I've cited and being put on the web. And I will say, coincidentally, Ghost Hunters started in 2004. So it's interesting how those stories permeated just the media after that kind of landmark TV show aired. It was really common. We got a lot more ghost stories after Ghost Hunters started because it changed the way people framed ghost stories in their local area. It makes this kind of podcast, we can do it now and talk about it, and people find it interesting. They don't want to throw us immediately into an asylum. So there was a lot of cultural change because of Ghost Hunters, but I find it one of the big kind of red flags folklorists have is anything that comes after 2004, if it's new, it may be biased and maybe what we call fake lore, which is.
Do you think though those shows could also trigger something in people and they remember something from their childhood that they
like
didn't think much
recovering
of, or
lost memories. So it was interesting doing the history of this and trying to figure out, because what we're largely there's almost nothing really documented about the Lennox building happening. Like I could not find Luke's Lodge that saved my life. Could not find advertisements. I looked at vintage photos of Oakley taken from the streetcar, and I could not get a good enough photo of the Lennox building to make out who was occupying that area. So this would be something that probably would need more digging into, of going to the actual historical society and digging into the blueprints of the area. But I was able from the auditor's office get a list of who owned the building from 1945 until today.
Oh, wow.
And because it was written in anything that is older than I think 2000 was on manually written cards. And what the auditor's office did is just take photos of these cards and posted them on the auditor's website. So that's how come I know that it was the two Marys that owned the building. And it seems to be that the Mary family here just kept giving it to different members of the family. And I can pull it up actually. Let's see, because I was looking at it not too long ago. So basically it was October 18th, 1946, Mary Dyer takes possession of the building. Then on November 20th, 1946, just a month later, Mary L. Her last name, Fagali. Sorry, I am so sorry. I am trying to pronounce this name fairly and not killing it. I'm not killing it. Anyway, so that Mary L, ended up having this building until 1965, and she seems to have deeded it to Morris Mandel as the trustee. And then Morris Mandel gave it to Philip Mandel and all of his entailments. Then until 1977. Then November 22nd, 1977, Salone Stein got the building. And then December 8th, 1978, the Lennox Building Partnership was created. And then February 13th, 1985, the Lennox Realty Company was created. And that would have been, by that time, Habits Cafe would have been in the building for 5 years when the Lennox Realty Company was created. The interesting thing is when Mark Rogers sold the building, the entire thing was a huge hubbub in Oakley, because basically Rogers had an understanding, as well as all the owners, of how they would lease out the space. And it was like that for almost 40 years. But when the new owners purchased it, the Lennox Realty Company did not put in a caveat saying how the space would be rented out to Habits. And that's what actually forced Habits and this is all the news articles that I was reading, that's how Habits ended up having to vacate within a few weeks, from that space, and it's gone to instead the Oakley Fish, was it Oakley Fish restaurant, and then that turned into Rosewood Thai Sushi. That's how those places managed to be there instead, and then Zypher Hairstyling, I think, took over a smaller side of that space. And now I think it's Prestige owns it, and they rent out all, at least they're the ones that rent out all of the apartments. And none of the apartments are for rent right now. All of them are full. So I was looking
It's
at
a good location.
it is
It
a very
is.
good location,
Walking
unless
distance
you
to a lot
want
of
to
great stuff.
park.
Yeah.
If you want to park,
Yeah.
it's a terrible.
I
So
was gonna say that. I always dreaded parking when I went to Amazon.
so
made me so
I
anxious.
don't totally understand why they had to leave so quickly. Was it just
Tenancy rules, so they were doing a month-to-month rental by that time. And if you get it, I'm not sure what what the laws are for retail and bar establishments in a space. I know for I think normal residential, you have to give at least 30 days ahead notice that the rental agreement's being terminated. And that is also, I can't answer that question because it wasn't in an article.
so they never said in an article why they had to leave. They just said suddenly get out. You have 30 days.
You basically have 30 days.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I'd be curious to know what happened. I mean,
yeah.
it's interesting because it had been there and they had remodeled actually. I mean, it had
Mhm.
been recently remodeled and it seemed like they were doing pretty good. And then all of a sudden they were gone.
It was a huge shock. Everyone in Oakley was just like, "What?"
Yeah.
Like that was our bar. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's sad they couldn't at least move somewhere else or come to some sort of agreement, but it sounds like maybe the new owners just wanted them out.
yeah,
Just
maybe
to be able to charge maybe more rent. I know that happens a lot.
that may
Well,
be a
that's what I
bit
was
what it
wondering.
was. Yeah.
Maybe they had some sort of agreement where they weren't paying that much and they wanted
Yeah.
it to be a lot bigger.
Mhm.
Because I will tell you, many times my mom and stepdad would look at new places to start a restaurant. And of
Mhm.
course, it was rent based.
Mhm.
And when these huge corporations own things, like they had an offer to go in at the banks, and the amount of rent they would have had to pay, they wouldn't have made hardly anything.
Right.
I mean, it's ridiculous. And then you always run the risk of your whatever they want to put something new in there. And you got to get out. Bye, because
Yeah.
we want something
Yeah,
different.
it seems like the Michael Dougherty, who owns Anything Airbrushed, had a location in downtown Cheviot, and his place did really well. But the
Mhm.
owner of the building decided they wanted to put something else in there, so they were just kind of like, "You have to leave."
Mhm.
So I guess
Yeah.
that happens a lot. It doesn't really
Yeah.
matter how the business is doing. I think he wanted to put a bar in there and just
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
made
And
him
this
leave.
is speculation on our part. We don't know.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
we
can
don't
only
know.
take off from the information gained from all the interviews.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, I
almost
mean, it
wanted
may
to
not
call
have
an
been
exit
any. It
interview.
could have been that they had something else in mind, or maybe they had an offer, or it's hard
Yeah.
to say.
It's hard.
Very
But
hard to say.
yeah, people were sad, and the neighborhood was hoping that they were able to move to the laundromat across the street, and that never happened because COVID was a thing
Yeah.
and is a thing. It's
Mhm.
not past tense,
It's not gone
and
away.
it's not gone away.
No.
But
But
yeah,
wreaked havoc on the restaurant industry.
it
That's
did.
for
It
sure.
really did. So
Mhm.
it's just interesting having a ghost story in I really like actually how the the police historian was able to come in and say, "Well, yes, we did have a crooked cop in Oakley, but it was the 1970s." And that actually led me down an entire different rabbit hole where our permitting for the state of Ohio changed in 1976. And when that happened, a lot of issues like this just suddenly popped up, and the Inquirer is full of stories of weird little permit um I guess buddy cop things where like these bars and establishments would be on like giving what I guess crooked cops, but basically cops would be on the take about like or really easy like how should I say this?
Well, liquor licenses are a big thing. Like
They're very hard to
Yeah.
get.
yeah, there have been
And
some restaurants that were closed down because they lost their liquor license.
yeah, and
And that always
exactly.
seemed a little bit there's some sus stuff going on there.
Yeah, with some sus stuff going on, but all over Cincinnati, not just in Oakley,
No,
and
yes,
no-
yes.
and
all
more
over.
than
Yeah.
just one police officer. But what I also found interesting was the similarities that this story had to the Cleveland Syndicate stories from Newport, and where they had somebody on the take and had police that were crooked and working for them, and that's how they were so powerful for so long. They still are. It's
Mhm.
just the game has changed a little bit. So don't come after us, Mafia. I know nothing.
Not that I condone the mafia, but I am endlessly fascinated by it.
Yeah.
Well, heck,
And-
even our legislature gets bribed quite a bit. One could
Yeah.
say.
That does happen. But it's just a very interesting ghost story because it's a Professor John, oh my God, Bruhand. My memory today, just like my voice, has just been blah. But anyway, it is a great urban legend because it has that kernel of truth where it sounds plausible. And I
Mhm.
don't deny that there's probably a ghost or two in the Lennox building because I've heard former residents, talk about hearing phantom footsteps, feeling being watched, doors opening and closing on their own, and just feeling it voices also. They would hear phantom voices that they knew it wasn't their neighbors or anyone on the street. It would be like somebody kind of like you, Jen, where what was it Chris's spirit guide was talking in your ear, just like they'd be lying in bed.
Raindrop.
Yeah. And going like, Chris has to poop, like that kind of thing. So they knew it's not noise from outside. And it's so there's something up with the Lennox building. I don't think
Yeah.
this is the story, though, is the thing.
Mhm. Fascinating.
It was
wonder-
it's like it was just like dealing with Step Cemetery in Indiana and uncovering the entire mythology built around that cemetery and just deconstructing it. And it turned out the ghost story was a mannequin on a wire. And I feel this has that kind of feel to me about a mannequin on a wire. That's the type of story this is.
Well, you
But-
know, and it's funny with true crime stories. It's always the people that find the body. Oh, I thought it was a mannequin at first.
Oh my
It's
God,
never a mannequin.
It's never a mannequin. Yeah.
Not that that's funny. It's just a weird correlation, I guess.
It's interesting that it's where the human brain immediately goes to, is that
Well,
it has
because
to
they
be a
can't-
mannequin stuffed in
I
the
think
Yeah, because
suitcase.
it's not real. It's not a person.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's your brain trying to
Protecting.
pigeonhole in.
Yeah.
I think your brain's hoping that it's a mannequin
Yeah.
rather
Yeah.
than a
Yeah.
And I
mannequin.
don't. Those poor people. That fun.
Yeah, finding
topic, but-
bodies,
no.
it's hard to you can't mentally prepare for it. The only thing that will is experience.
Yeah.
And yeah, that would be your brain with the mannequin carpentalment. I cannot say.
Compartmentalization. I can't say it either.
Compartmentalization. Nobody can say it.
Wow, all of our listeners have just turned off. There was
Yeah,
like
they've turned
these
off.
girls
Well,
are done.
that's why we edit.
Yeah, that's why we.
Compartmentalization.
There
Yes.
you go.
Christina wins the cookie for tonight for being able to say that.
I can say it in my head.
I can say it in my
You
head
know,
too.
it's
just
you know, sometimes you get tongue tied. It's
oh,
easy to happen.
that was my day today.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's. What are your thoughts? I've talked about my thoughts. What are your thoughts on this story?
I mean, I think that there's probably a lot of haunted places in Oakley. I mean, they're older. It's an older area. A lot of it's probably seen a lot of drama. I mean, those apartment buildings are pretty interesting on Mark Bright, that whole area down there. I mean, it's probably there's a lot of stories probably behind those areas.
Well, it's interesting because basically all of Oakley, what you see today, is from about 1915 on.
Oh, wow.
Because a lot of these houses are built for the people that worked for the mill.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So it's just the entire, and even if you go to the Kroger that's in Oakley near the Cinemark and all that, the huge Super Kroger.
Mhm.
They have a huge mural. I almost called it a mural. Oh my goodness, tonight. I am so sorry, everyone. They have a huge mural that is along the checkout lanes, which gives the story of Oakley, and the mill and everything is at the very
Oh,
beginning of it.
wow.
I'll have
So,
to look like I don't know if I'd noticed that. I mean, I've been to
Me
that
neither.
Kroger several times,
Same.
but I've
mhm.
Yeah.
not noticed the mural.
Yeah, when you're bored and waiting for a line to open at the fast checkout, I was just staring up there once and I'm like, hey, this is the history of Oakley. So,
That's kind of cool that they did that.
It
yeah,
is cool.
it's a cute little touch that I think gets ignored a lot. Just people don't realize what they're
Well, I
looking
mean,
at.
it's sad that Oakley's getting rid of some of their history. Like, it's really tragic
Oh,
that they knocked down that Kenner factory. It
I
was a beautiful
know
Art Deco building,
it was.
and
yes.
the
And you
architects
worked
tried to.
there, right?
I did not work there. Troy worked at Kenner, and it was still operating when he worked there
Mhm.
in the 80s, and he
Mhm.
went there to look at prototypes and stuff.
Oh,
So
Mhm.
cool.
so he did get to engage with it when he was working there.
Yeah.
You know what I found fascinating about that is that right before they tore it down, I went there and probably trespassed and walked around the building and took pictures. And there's train tracks right behind it, and they had
Mhm.
an offshoot that went directly to the warehouse, like with
Mhm.
all the doors that the semis would pull into.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I'm like, oh my God, I bet you they just loaded straight to the trains.
Oh
I don't know
yeah,
if
That's
all
that's
those
exactly what
true
they
or
did.
not,
Yeah.
all
but
those Star Wars figures.
yeah, I just
Yeah.
thought it was cool, and I
Yeah.
love old buildings like that, and I
Oh, I
really
did
wanted to
too.
go
And
in there.
they did keep some of the US playing card building, but most of it's been
Mhm.
Yeah,
knocked down too. I
yeah,
mean, it's
Yeah.
just sad to see these companies go away.
Yeah.
yeah.
Note for listeners, that's an active railroad track. Do not walk on it.
No, I
And
didn't. No.
yeah, it's a former Cincinnati rail was turned into the Wasson Way, that foot project. It's not the actual Wasson Road, it is the pedestrian trail that's next to it. That used to be train tracks. The entirety of Oakley was just train. It was
The
just all train
crossroads.
loading, and yeah, it was a crossroads basically. What makes me really sad is one of our original turnpike houses was demolished last year
Hmm.
and turned
Oh,
into two smaller houses. It's on Woodland,
Hmm.
right off of Mason Madison Road. Sorry, not Mason Road. Madison Road. It is original 1872 Madison Turnpike house, and it was not in great condition, but really should have been saved because it had that. I call it adorable, but it's the very simple um square house with the square windows, and then as time went on they kept doing additions, and the additions are also squares, and it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, so it ended up looking like a yellow caterpillar house.
Oh, that's cool.
So it had a lot of property because it was one of the original houses of Oakley,
aw,
and they tore it down, and now
Oh,
it's
they're just
two small
it's
houses.
building madness. They're
I
just
yeah.
really
building. I
there's
mean, it's crazy how much they're building right now everywhere.
there's
Well, you
only a
know,
few of
it's
them left.
funny because they don't want to deal with the old stuff and it's expensive and
It
whatever,
is to
but
refit.
newer construction isn't the same, and you're just going to
Mm-mm.
have problems with it sooner than you would have
Mhm.
with the old places. So,
That is
Yeah,
very true,
it's
but
sad.
it made
I
me
did want
so
to
upset.
say about I it tickles me that he's a man in white. I don't know why I really like that,
Because it
but
throws the trope on
There's
its
a
head. We
yeah.
don't get too many men
Oh,
in
and
white.
No.
I looked up Zoot Suit, and it was, as you said, it was out of the jazz sort of culture, which
Mhm.
I guess you could compare the jazz culture to the hip hop culture today. It was sort of
Mhm.
people obviously, they used to think people, like, if you watch the musical Chicago and they say that she was influenced by jazz, it was the same
Mhm.
sort of racism that happens now with rap and stuff like that. But it was
Mhm.
Yeah.
jazz was its grandfather, I guess, right?
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
Zoot Suit was a big, like, they had these big shoulder pads. You see them drawn in a lot of old cartoons,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
you know,
And a
Well,
lot
they
of
they
people
made a
depicted
comeback in
they
the early
did.
aughts, didn't they? It
They
was
they
like the
um,
did
late
of
90s.
sorts. Yeah,
Yeah.
occasionally you'll see, but
yeah.
but yeah, they said Dizzy Gillespie and some of the other famous performers were them, and
Mhm.
and again, there was some serious racism around. It was like a culture war kind of thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, what I was gonna say is in a lot of the older cartoons, the characters wearing zoot suits usually were depicted as being wolves, which is not exactly a positive depiction.
Fairly
So
racist,
it was
probably.
fairly racist. So
Thinking of
that's a
the
big
Definitely.
Jessica
problem.
Rabbit one.
Yeah,
Wasn't there one in Jessica Rabbit?
I think
Yeah,
so.
it's based on the old Tex Avery cartoons, but
Yeah.
yes, it's sort of like in Harry Potter where where they have the goblins. It's sort of a
Mhm.
very thinly veiled, maybe not that thinly,
No, it's
Yeah.
like
obviously.
tissue
Eh,
paper thin, like
exactly.
obvious.
hmm
Yeah. So,
It's a
yeah. So
fairly
it's
offensive trope.
yeah, but it's interesting that that's how he was depicted. It also makes me wonder when this was witnessed, because if it was around the time of Roger Rabbit, that would
Yeah.
make more sense if it was kids reporting it.
Yeah.
So it just
Oh, that's true. I didn't think about that.
yeah, like
And
what influenced the kids to see that, and there's a whole lot of just psychology that goes into this.
yeah.
You can see why I was fascinated by this particular story, because we have 3 different versions of the
Yeah.
story. 3. 2 of them are
Mhm.
very similar and 1 is very different. I don't know how the 3rd one came to be. It sounded like somebody who had heard the story, couldn't remember
Mhm.
it right, and then told it that way,
Get
and
the
that's how it
telephone.
got yeah, it was a
Yeah.
very, very telephone worked perfectly in this particular thing, where the message got skewed, and it got published in other publications. That one was from a wine magazine where I found that it was just kind of like, "Okay, well, that was a story. It's still a part of this larger legend, so I'm including it."
Yeah.
So it's and also for our listeners, if you have heard the story of Habits Cafe, been to Habits Cafe, have any input whatsoever, you can always email us at hometownhauntedmail@gmail.com.
Let me put up that ticker.
Yeah,
Also, if you live there and will let us come over and do a ghost hunt, that'd be cool.
Have us over for lunch. We can have a sandwich, maybe an ostrich burger.
No,
well,
thank you. I'll just
I
take
will
a grilled cheese.
say I've been to Rosewood. It is excellent.
Mm.
So please go support them. They were doing very good food, and
Oh,
I
good.
enjoyed them a lot. They used to be the Oakley Fish House, and now they're they're just rebranded, but they're really good. Go there. It's great. So
Okay, we have a hometown haunt from Jess. When I was a teen, I had a blanket taken from me while I was sleeping. I felt something grab my toe and I woke up with it across the room. Then, as soon as I was awake, the fire alarm went off. I always thought it was a warning to the alarm. There was no fire, but the house did have a fire in it when it was an old farmhouse.
Interesting.
That is the way I read that was that her toe went across the room, not the blanket. Sorry,
Well,
I said
Jess.
it that way too.
Have
Like, did
you?
the ghost take your toe?
There are ghost stories.
Is that seems like people being awakened in emergencies? Is that a common
Oh yeah.
pantheon
Yeah,
for
that is. That's a
ghosts?
common it's huh. So that thank you, Jess, for submitting that story. That's really good. Yes, basically ghosts that are caretakers of property and see themselves as caretakers of families very commonly will wake up people if they think there's an emergency. The one that I point to the most often for this would be Suzanne at Writer's Inn in Painesville, Ohio. So this is a original stagecoach inn from the early 1800s, and Suzanne is the 3rd wife of John Writer, who owned the stagecoach inn, and she died by actually falling into the fireplace. So, yeah, she has been seen since then, since about 1816, basically protecting the building, and she has woken up the owners several times. She has called fire and police several times. She has appeared in her nightgown in the front doorway to get police into the building when there was a furnace. The furnace room was the boiler had broken and was flooding the basement.
Wow.
So she's lit candles. She's done all sorts of, she's, when I say lit candles, around the building to basically lead a path for the owner to find issues going on in the basement. There's all sorts of just stories that she has trying to alert people to needs of the building. So that's very much what this
That's a
kind of
cool
reads as.
ghost.
Yeah,
That's a
I
cool
love
ghost.
Suzanne. She's probably my
Yeah.
favorite ghost of all time. And
Mhm.
she, Lady in Gray, she's been seen standing at the stairs on the stairs as well of the building. So that's a really cool place to
How
go,
did
by the
she
way.
fall into the fireplace? Was it a big fireplace, like a
It,
kitchen?
yeah, if you can imagine back,
What a horrible way to die.
it's
Poor
it actually
thing.
was a very common way of dying.
They were. Side note, before you go on, have you ever been to the Grove Park Inn in Nashville?
No.
Okay, I stayed there once with my mom. It's a real big, very expensive, beautiful place. But in the lobby, there is a ginormous fireplace that I could go into. I could walk into it and stand up, right?
Yeah.
So I was just like, kids should not be playing in front of that. They're going to trip and fall and go in there.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there was nothing to keep them from going in there.
Oh, geez.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Go
no,
ahead.
a lot of the older buildings, I know there's a lot of historical buildings that you can go into in Hamilton and in Middletown that basically have kept those fireplaces. They're huge stone fireplaces, and they're exactly the way, at least the one at Ryder's Inn is exactly the same way, where you can walk into it. And women would constantly die of not self-immolation, but they would catch on fire. Their dresses or their skirts would catch on fire. And little girls as well, anybody working in the kitchen was at risk of catching on fire. And
Yeah, their
especially
clothing didn't help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she got on fire. And the interesting story with that is in Ohio, there was no obituary written for her. I only knew that she had died because Joseph, I think I called him John earlier, but Joseph remarried only like 2 months later to his fourth wife. But the interesting thing is Suzanne was from a prominent family in New York State, and they wrote about her death announcement dying of catching on fire in their local newspaper. So it was an interesting
She wasn't pushed.
That is one of the great mysteries and why she's included in Ohio's Haunted Crimes. Because it is strongly suspected that Joseph was killing his wives. Because 2 of them were pushed down the stairs, and one of them died of a heart attack. And they
that's very suspect.
It's very suspect. He lived for a very long time. His last wife and all of his descendants maintained the Stagecoach Inn for a very long time, up until the 1900s. But I think it only fell out of the family after the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
But this is a story I'm trying to remember from like 2014 when I wrote it. But yeah, I've been there.
Was pushed. She still has great love for the place.
She loved it a lot. She was really excited to become basically not the housekeeper, but keep the house for the place. She was excited to be a caretaker, excited to be a Stagecoach Inn caretaker, was by all accounts a very friendly innkeeper, and all that, made really good food, was very popular with the people, and then died unexpectedly.
I was gonna say, it reminds me of Ma Green too.
Yeah, and Ma Green also kind of does the same thing on the Delta Queen.
Yeah, didn't she keep it from wrecking or something? Like if something was going wrong,
No, when they tried to put a bar in, she had
But there was
hit a
another
barge.
story too where she like kept it from doing something. Like there was some sort of
Oh, the
fire or
boiler
something.
was
Yeah,
the
there was
boiler
something
room
like
was
that, and
leaking.
she alerted someone.
Yeah, the boiler room was leaking, and she alerted the captain. So she's another specter that does that. So this Justice story reminds me, and reminded you, Christina, of these caretaker spirit.
Yeah.
I almost called it a trope, but
like when people are still injured today cooking, but my great grandmother died of burns from cooking. I don't know the whole story, and my uncle said before he passed away that she had actually spilled boiling water on herself. I'm not sure what happened, but she didn't live much longer after that. Like she had a lot of third-degree burns.
Ouch.
And
Poor
I don't even know
lady.
today if they have much better treatment. I mean, I think they do have better ways with skin grafting, and I mean, they're talking about painful injuries.
Yeah, basically they're trying to keep you from dying of infection.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, that's ow.
Yeah.
Ow.
Yeah, that's That's a hard one to come back from.
Mhm.
Those kind of
Mhm.
burns.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and this would have been in the 20s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My sister used to work on the burn unit as a social worker at UC.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know how she did it.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
It's
incredible.
yeah, horrific. I mean, I think they are getting better at treating, like you said, keeping the infection down, but also like those wounds are particularly painful.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, and especially if they're over a large percentage of your body. I mean,
Mhm.
that's a trauma that your body just can't come back from.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, on that cheery note,
Oh yeah, now we can end the show.
Can I add one more thing
sure.
Yes.
about waking up? I love to hear the stories about animals saving their owners
Mhm.
too when the houses are on fire or somebody's
Mhm.
coming in to get them, or I
Mhm.
always like those stories too. That's what that reminded me of.
Ah, yeah. So if you have
Yeah, that's
stories like that,
Yeah.
please send them to hometownhauntedmail@gmail.com. And thank you for putting up with us this episode. My goodness. Wow, the long holidays certainly messed with my head. I don't know if it messed with yours. But also, you can follow us at Sin Cabinet Curio on Twitter, at Cincy Cabinet of Curiosities on Instagram, and also share your own hometown haunts from your neck of the woods on our Facebook group, Hometown Haunts. All right. I'm Cat Loco. We got Jen and Christina. Thank you. Stay spooky
Bye.
and good night.
Bye.